Listen to the Impact Podcast on all your favorite podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Audible, Spotify, Stitcher, and of course, at impactpodcast.com. This edition of the Impact Podcast is brought to you by ERI. ERI has a mission to protect people, the planet, and your privacy, and is the largest fully integrated IT and electronics asset disposition provider and cybersecurity-focused hardware destruction company in the United States, and maybe even the world. For more information on how ERI can help your business properly dispose of outdated electronic hardware devices, please visit eridirect.com. This edition of the Impact Podcast is brought to you by Engage. Engage is a digital booking platform revolutionizing the talent booking industry. With thousands of athletes, celebrities, entrepreneurs, and business leaders, Engage is the go-to spot for booking talent, for speeches, custom experiences, live streams, and much more. For more information on Engage or to book talent today, visit letsengage.com. Welcome to another edition of the Impact Podcast. I'm so excited to have with you today David Daoud. He's the president and principal analyst at Compliance Standards, LLC. Welcome to the Impact Podcast, David.
Thank you, John. Thank you for having me. Much appreciated.
Of course. And before we get talking about all the important stuff you're doing at Compliance Standards, David, can you share a little bit about your background, where you grew up, and how you even got this career trajectory that you're on right now?
Yes, thank you, John. This is going to take probably 3 hours. No, I'm just kidding.
That's okay.
I'm an immigrant. I moved in the U.S. in 1990 from Algeria, which many people tell me, oh, Nigeria. I say, no, it's Algeria, which is North Africa. A lesser known country than Nigeria, obviously.
Right.
When I moved, I've already spent some time working in the oil industry, as in oil economics. I'm a person who handles issues of, optimizing performance in, for example, the distribution sector for gasoline and things like that. So I spent probably about a year after I graduated from university with a degree in the oil economics sector. I moved to Boston, and back then, my goal was sort of the goal of every young person is to get an MBA from Harvard University.
Right.
Never happened.
Right.
It never happened. It was I didn't have the language. I couldn't speak English at that point. I didn't have the money to cover the cost of an MBA in such a prestigious university. So I settled with a master's in oil economics. International economics at Suffolk University. Lesser known university, but still very much central in Boston. So
right.
It was fun. While I was doing there, I had the opportunity to teach a couple of courses, starting with computer science, and then eventually I did English as a second language. It taught me to connect with various cultures in and around the city of Boston. It was fun. I applied to various jobs. I had a job with Harvard University as a data analyst. Apparently, at that point, I was pretty good with statistics, and they needed a person to crunch numbers to focus on the healthcare sector. So it's really the impact. My focus was on the impact of various medical programs, healthcare programs, on mortality, of all things. And so I spent about 3 years with Harvard, and then I wanted to get into the private sector. I applied for a company called Computer World, which was still a publication that caters to IT folks. And my job there was to do primary research. We had a base of about 200,000 IT managers. And my job as an analyst was to essentially extract additional information that eventually folks in the editorial world would reuse to sort of form their opinion And there was also a research service that we offered to our readers. So if you are an IT manager, you read Computer World and you want to have an understanding above and beyond sort of the editorial, then that's the kind of research that I was doing. Computer World is owned by IDG, which is sort of the parent company, International Data Group.
Right.
So it was fairly easy to move from a place that is focused on information, that is a media outlet, to an advisory company called IDC, which is also owned by International Data Corporation, IDG, International Data Group. The company has changed its name since the passing of its owner. But then, so from Computer World to IDC, starting as an analyst, to a research manager, to a research director, and then to 2014, where I thought, it's time to start again, fresh.
Wow.
And so, hence the creation of Compliance Standard in 2014. How did I get into the end of life, or the ITS at this position?
Yeah.
Pure coincidence, really. In 2003, there was a company that needed an analyst opinion on, or projections on, what the device market is going to look like in the future. Okay. And so my boss then was contacted by eScrap folks that organized the conference, and he couldn't make it, so the next person to send was me. And so I did provide a presentation to the eScrap folks back in 2003, and I found it fascinating. My coverage prior to that was the brand new equipment market, whether it's laptops and tablets and desktops back then, etc. So that was sort of the vision that I had, the view that I have. That right. Conference essentially gave me a sort of a different perspective on the IT world, on the end of life part. And it was fun. It was fascinating. It was, and by the way, it is still a sector that is not properly covered by the analyst world. And so I find myself as sort of the only person on the analyst world feeling excited about it. And right. I thought, okay, we probably could make a career out of it. And so that's what I've been doing since 2014, essentially. But that's how I got into this very interesting sector.
And I'm on your website now, and it's called compliancestandards.com. And for our listeners and viewers to find David and all his important work that he's doing, you could go to compliancestandards.com. So what was your real vision when you were starting this? Why did you come up with compliance standards, and what does that mean for the industry as a whole?
Well, so I'm going to say a few things that perhaps folks in the industry may not like, but in terms of the perception of the end of life in general, by many folks, especially the ones that are responsible for paying the bill, that is the end user corporations in general, it's an unknown entity, this end of life. It's not really something that they go to school to learn, or they take extra courses to learn. It's much more complex than sort of your typical help desk in an IT department. And yet it's not getting enough attention for a number of reasons. At least one of them, at least I can cite a few of them, but one of them is it's perceived as a cost center. Folks in IT industry, in IT departments, in the corporate settings, they look at it and they say, well, we're going to spend money. If we don't spend money, we're going to spend resources. We're going to have people doing X, Y, Z, and that's a cost center for us. And as a result, the second element is it's poorly managed, poorly done, poorly understood. Back in the beginning of my research cycle on Itad, we were able to determine that there were at least 7 stakeholders that need to be part of the decision-making in Itad, not necessarily be doing the day-to-day task, but at least you have the compliance guys, you have the finance guy, you have the facility guy. You have a number of people, generally 7 of them, that ought to be giving directions and standards on how to deal with end of life. And fortunately, we don't see that, rarely. I'm sure there's some companies, we know some companies do that, But the vast majority of companies rely on sort of the IT department to do everything. And quite often, IT departments, we know it's very difficult to ask a help desk person or the guy who handles desktop deployment and maintenance to also understand the compliance aspects of end of life. And so the term that I use in general to define where Itad sits in a general IT world, I call it an orphaned area or an orphaned sector. And again, it's not a blanket judgment on everyone in the corporate world, but look, I mean, we see all these news coming from, for example, the retailers. The retailers have been notorious about the way they sort of handle their end of life. And so that's, to me, what I saw, John, is basically the big analyst firms starting something and then retracting and then moving away. IDC used to have grade. I used to spearhead that. They no longer have that. Gartner used to have, I think, the Magic Quadrant. I don't think they have it anymore. The people within these organizations that cover end of life, generally, again, end of life is sort of the secondary thing. They have something else, leasing, financing, or general IT management. And then end of life tends to be the afterthought. And to me, I thought, look, there is a vibrant market. There is a vibrant group of companies that are doing cool things. How do we get to a point where we get them interested in understanding their market, understanding data, understanding user behavior, and sort of that's where I would like to be, thinking that this is what we are focusing on within compliance standards.
If you've just joined us, if you're a listener or viewer who's just joined us, we've got David Daoud with us today. He's the president and principal analyst at Compliance Standards. To find David and his important and great work, go to compliancestandards.com. So you talked about how this used to be characterized or seen, David, as a cost center. Explain to me and to our audience the evolution from the 1990s and early 2000s of the misperceptions of this sector, of this reuse sector of the old electronics to 2023 and how it should be perceived today and the great opportunities that lay in this business and why your work is so important to help further rationalize this industry, which has been so diverse and dispersed over the years.
Yes, John, absolutely. Look, I'm going to start with the post-2000 era.
Okay.
Prior to that, of course, we had ITS at disposition by virtue of having companies involved in leasing and financing, the IBMs of the world, by virtue of having companies like HP and Dell essentially engaging in leasing, for example. But let's start with 2000, post-2000 era. The biggest sort of driver that sort of led to the ITAD being an interesting sector or topic is really, if you remember this green IT discussion. What happened is we went from a barrel of oil at certain low price to doubling, tripling over time, and that created a lot of a debate within sort of the corporate world on how can we green our business, how can we reduce our environmental footprint. And so every sector within the corporate world began to look at ways to optimize and minimize energy consumption, optimize utilization, and end of life became one of that. It became one small section of a bigger thing. So at that point, what sort of other things people were talking about? Well, companies that produce, OEMs that produce products, they were looking at ways to optimize product in terms of product design, in terms of energy consumption, etc. And so 2003, 2004, you had a lot of interest in how to green things. And you see a number of companies, the big ones, the Intels of the world talking about it, Dells of the world talking about it. you see an influx of capital into the Itad sector. People interested because all of a sudden recycling becomes part of the solution. And so you see that coming. You see the money moving in. You see companies, smaller companies getting slightly bigger. You see the Antikras of the world back in the old days. So you begin to see some traction. And then that probably lasted about 4 or 5 years. And then 2008 comes. What you have sort of the downturn, the financial downturn, the economic crisis that we had back then had a really bad impact on pretty much the entire green IT story.
Right.
And obviously the end of life also felt the brunt of that economic downturn. But what happened is companies started to really scale back their projects, including end of life, and the smaller companies and the medium-sized companies that were in the Itad space began to feel the pressure, the financial pressure. And what you have after that, around 2010, you have really very aggressive companies such as Arrow that found it very interesting to buy or to acquire entities that were in that space in an effort to consolidate. And the idea then was to essentially create a closed loop life cycle. So you're involved in selling assets, brand new assets. You're involved in selling brand new computers. Then you can handle also the end of life. And so it creates an interesting loop. The problem is it was done, most of these acquisitions, the execution part of that was not the best, was very challenging for the companies that were involved. And what you see is basically another round of sort of downturn with sort of Arrow leaving the sector, and that's where we are today. So where are we today? Well, the opportunities, as you pointed out, are there. I mean, we're talking about billion, maybe 6 to 9 billion assets, new assets getting into the market every year worldwide. These are enormous numbers, John. And we still haven't really figured out 100% how the recycling part of it is going to happen and is going to work. Perhaps, maybe I'm naive, maybe each industry, each sector doesn't have sort of a set situation, that it evolves over time, that nothing is stable. Perhaps that's where we are, but clearly there are enormous opportunities. The problem, these opportunities that are facing today are sort of the big geopolitical problems, the Russian war in Ukraine, the stance of the Chinese in terms of opening up their market or simplifying the imports, for example. Inflation is creating a lot of headaches, and obviously, folks that are in the logistics know it. People that use logistics are aware of it. Companies that are, that have operations with brick and mortar operations with people, they feel certainly the part of the inflation, and so that creates cost and it creates uncertainty. In the meanwhile, we really haven't changed our stance vis-a-vis the customer. The customer today, especially the large enterprise, by the way, the biggest source of profitability in the Itad centers around specific vertical markets. We know retail is not one of them. We know how they're doing. But clearly, companies involved in doing business with the financial sector,
healthcare,
with the healthcare sector, typically financial sector, they like to turn around their products every 3 years. So they're looking for the latest technology. They have the money for it. They're willing to spend the money, reluctantly, but they have to do it. The healthcare sector, likewise, they need the best imaging technology and etc. So these definitely are sort of the best in terms of profitability source. And I always tell my clients, whatever go-to-market you have, it has to be a vertical play. You cannot have one sales guy that knows very well the retail market who's going to be selling to an investment bank. You have to be able to talk and speak the same language. And so these opportunities are there. The problem is many of these customers themselves are facing a global sort of geopolitical problems, and they're always looking for ways to minimize cost, maximize return, etc. And so, but the opportunity is there. All the people that are watching this are aware that there is the amount of devices and electronics hitting the market every year is mind-boggling, and it's going. It certainly is not just your laptop. I mean, we're moving away from your classic mass market PC to smaller devices, a huge amount of smaller devices, smaller amount of big enterprise devices, enterprise systems. But the market is there, and that's something that the industry will have to figure out how to approach that sector going forward.
David, let's talk about a couple of things that have happened in recent years. One, the pandemic. I agree with you that the Itad market is massive and bigger opportunity than ever before. In your eyes, how did the pandemic affect the Itad market? Going in, coming out, where were we, and what did the pandemic actually do to disrupt or accelerate the Itad marketplace?
Well, it's probably the same effect, John, as the brand new equipment market.
Okay.
Probably the same. What I mean by that is it's been going through sort of a rubber band effect, right? The pandemic is here. People are slowing down, trying to figure out what's going on. The government is spending money on stimulus. People are buying, and more people are working from home. People are buying. Again, this is not the enterprise class. This is mostly sort of the mass market, the mass consumer market. So if you look at the data on brand new equipment market, the shipments are sort of your up and down thing, like the yo-yo thing. It goes up and down. And so during the pandemic, there was obviously a pickup due to people working from home. And the last set of data that I saw from the likes of IDC and Gartner, the numbers really looked pretty bad. But again, it's a reaction from a very strong demand in the previous cycle, if you will. I think the Itad sort of mimics a little bit that image, where you have demand up and down. But again, if you look at, to me, really, if you go beyond the units, beyond the numbers, and you go to sort of the profitability, it's really the banks, the hospitals. Hospitals have been incredibly busy. They've had so much money to spend because obviously they were at the forefront of the crisis. Right. The financial sector, there's been an enormous amount of work trying to move to the cloud, getting their employees work from home, getting their customers no longer come to the office. Right. So there have been a lot of investments in new devices in those sectors. And and I think that's pretty good. Now, what's happening elsewhere? Well, you look at the retailers, for example, they had to close. A lot of them actually went out of business. Right. And so that means, if you are in the business of dealing with point of sale terminals, and devices like that, then yes, you get into problems. Hence my earlier statement, John, that if you're going to look at the sector, in my humble opinion, then you have to look at it from the perspective of a vertical market. That's right. Where you try to drill down deeper and deeper into your existing markets or create new market opportunities by looking at where the opportunity comes from. That way you would compensate or offset for any loss that you would experience should that other sector feel really bad. So to me, that's what it is. But again, one last thing, John. A lot of the business that's feeding the Itad industry is not necessarily just the IT sort of manager that's doing business with them. It is the commodity market for all sorts of products. There's a lot of things that certainly plays into the bottom line of a very good active Itad company, and that's very difficult to analyze at once. I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening with China, for example, looking for changing its attitude on how things are happening, etc. So that's my point.
Well, let's talk about a couple of those external forces. You bring up a great point. When I met you 15 or 16 years ago, David, ESG the shift from linear to circular economy and sustainability weren't yet huge parts of our media lexicon, our day-to-day cultural vernacular. Now they're very common. Now there seems that these are unstoppable and undeniable trends. How does that positively affect the Itad industry as we know it today in 2023, now that these trends in America and the United States seem to really have taken hold?
Yeah, so maybe I'm going to sound a little contrarian, John. I do apologize in advance for people who may not have the same.
That's okay.
But you know, as an analyst working previously for IDC and for Computer World, it seems to me that there were discussions for a long, long time about sort of the circular economy. It had different terms, different terminology. Back in the old days, I think they used to call it a closed loop life cycle.
Right.
How do you achieve that in the current environment? That involves so many suppliers that are very careful about not sharing sort of, you know, what's under the hood, if you will. How do you get there? And to me, it's an absolutely noble goal, but it's a goal that will require more than statements about such as circular economy. Companies need to get together and agree on what it means. If, for example, if we run a survey today, John, and we're going to do that soon, on the consumer side, how do consumers recycle their devices? I think you got to find really interesting data that suggests that the circular economy is still a long way to go. It's still a long way to go. The retailers have to be on board. The distributors have to be on board. The people that are in our industry, the Itad guys, they need to be on board. The regulators have to be on board. There has to be a market above and beyond the US with global trade agreements that cement those markets. I think it's absolutely great to sort of push for things like a closed loop life cycle and circular economy, but it's something that it has to have meats around the bone to make it happen. And I'm not convinced yet, John, and I do apologize again. I'm not convinced that we're there yet. It's a very noble, it's a noble approach, but it's still going to be a long work in progress.
David, I'm on your website again for our listeners and viewers, compliancestandards.com. Couple things. What do? You have an annual scorecard. Talk a little bit about your annual scorecard and why is that so important to the Itad industry and for all the industry, like you say, the vertical industries that need guidance on how to pick great vendors and Itad companies. Explain why your standards are so important and your annual report is so important.
Yes, John. So this is something we've been doing for us. What I mean by for us is the typical engagement that we get from end user companies is really which company should we use. I mean, there's a number of good companies out there, and there's a lot more number of bad companies out there. And so their question is, who should we use? Questions that come from the corporate world vary from very simple things to extremely complicated things. Complicated things would be sort of an enterprise-wide deployment of Itad services. Seemingly simple thing would be, we have a number of assets in various bank branches. What is the best way to deal with that? Should we ask the Itad company to go pick them up in each branch, or should we consolidate them into one sort of a depot and then have them come? Little things that basically there's no one solution fits all. So what we've been doing is we've been going from company to company, and typically these surveys have between 180 to 250 respondents. Those are large companies. They're not really small companies. They're companies that have large deployments. And these are companies that have already existing relationships with Itad suppliers. Some of them have one Itad service provider. Others have up to 4 or 5 based on their supplier compliance rules. And so to us, it was a fairly simple thing to ask them, okay, how do you feel about your supplier or your service provider? And so we came up with a set of 6 or 7 matrix characteristics from pricing to management attitude, or how do you feel about the management in terms of being visionary or not, and scored them really. And we came up with a number of companies that really have scored 4.5. No one scored 5. I mean, that's probably statistically impossible.
Right.
But 4.5, there was a number of them, 5 or 6 probably, that seemed from the feedback of the customer. And this is not our opinion, John. This is the end user saying, that company and that company, we love what they're doing. And here are the areas where they're doing the best: pricing, execution, et cetera, et cetera. And so, for us, we use that tool to go back to our clients to say, hey, we do not know all of them. And here's why we don't know all of them: because they are privately owned companies, generally family-owned companies, and they will not share their data. However, people that have been using them, that's what they think. And to be honest, it's been actually a pretty fantastic tool for us. And we looked at some of the operating elements of these companies that have gotten 4, 4.5 in particular, but 4 as well, 4. And you can easily see that they have a very forward-looking management team, very active. They may not have sort of the latest ideas on how to deal with, for example, social media strategy. That's fine, but they're active. They're there. They are releasing data. They're releasing information. They have press releases. They have outreach programs that makes them, that in the mind of the outside observer, these are active people. And then you have the ones that you never hear nothing. You don't know who they are. You see the name, they're being used, and then you start looking at the ranks and at the ratings, and you realize, I don't know. Pricing is weird. Management vision not that great, and these are the ones. This is what the demand side is reporting. From our perspective, as I said, from an analyst perspective, we don't make too much judgment on this. We only try to interpret what the supply side is saying. And to me, how useful is it for an Itad company? Well, it is useful because if somebody says you do not have a vision, you got to figure out how to deal with this. What is it as defined as a vision? Maybe more engagement, more talk about new technologies, maybe more white papers. There's a number of ways that you can tweak your go-to-market strategy to make sure that your customer sees you in a good way. And that's what this particular project is attempting to do, for sure.
David, you've just recently launched the Itad Coalition and Itad Industry Advertising Initiatives. Can you explain to our audience what both these programs mean and why you're launching them?
Yes. So if you go back to what I was mentioning earlier, John, is this lack of centralized information, or this lack of information in general. The data suggests that the biggest source of information in the corporate world regarding end of life is the Itad company itself. The Itad company itself, which means that everything else, from the media to the nonprofit associations to the likes of, I'm not going to name names, but companies that have quadrants and that they have a minor role in framing the understanding of Itad in the minds of the end user. So the end user finds himself alone facing a supplier, and the supplier, they have an interest in saying what they have to say to them. And so the purpose of this, John, is to come up with a set of agreed upon methods or agreed upon processes on how to conduct ITS at disposition. And they already exist. I think what ITAD Company 1 and ITAD Company 2 and 3 say, typically they meet the same standard, right? Whether it is on certifications, whether it's on data security, whether it's on environmental stewardship, etc. It's all there, but rather than coming from the marketing material of an ITAD company to a client, it comes from a third party vetted process or vetting process. So that's what we're trying to do. So again, we would like to educate the end user market with the support of companies that are doing the work to make sure that it's done the right way, it's promoted the right way. And how do we go to market with that? Well, it's very simple. So we already have our customers that we educate on a daily basis, but we are also partnering with a pretty major media outlet out there to actually take those programs and advertise or put them out there in the market. So you're going to see some of the biggest publications in the IT world carrying that. We're going to have a website that is going to carry all the various white papers, and methodologies, and etc. And that's the idea, is essentially to make sure that
when will this launch? When will the advertising initiative and the ITAD coalition launch in your vision?
So we are giving ourselves about 2 months from now to gather sufficient interest around us to do it, and our media partners are ready to do it. They would do it anytime. It takes them a couple of weeks to do all the design elements. Part of it, by the way, for those interested, part of that would also be leads. So we recognize that smaller, medium-sized companies are interested in leads. They may not be necessarily interested in marketing, which is totally fine, but leads would be. So we will generate leads by virtue of having people going into the ITAD Academy. By the way, we call it ITAD Academy. By virtue of going to ITAD Academy, learning about how to do it and putting their information there, we'll be able to capture hopefully a number of leads that people can turn into, well, if they want to turn them into sales, then that's their job.
What's the fees to become a member of the ITAD Academy?
Well, so it will be there is a set of cost.
Okay.
That is going to go to the media partner, and basically the cost will be equally shared by the members. So if the cost is $100, for example,
right,
and there are 2 of them, it will be $50 each.
Understood.
If there will be 4 of them, it'll be $25 each, something like that. So we're keeping the cost.
Understood.
And we'll issue a press release on that at some point.
What's next? David, you've done so much already with compliance standards over the years. What's your vision besides this launch of the ITAD Coalition and the ITAD advertising initiatives? What's the future in the beyond the few months ahead, few years ahead, for what you're going to do with compliance standards?
Well, okay, so immediately there's another project that we're working with today. It was actually launched today in partnership with eScrap News. We launched a survey. Remember, most of the work that we do, John, is targeted to the end user. So the reason why we've been targeting the end user is because the ITAD sector generally is very closed sector. It's very difficult to get information. There are a few CEOs in the space that are very open-minded, and they share information under very clear, obviously, non-disclosure agreement. But in general, we've been focusing on the enterprise user world. This time, we're taking the chance, and we're asking your industry to please take a survey so that we understand the current performance of this industry in the first quarter and as we're going into the second quarter. And we want to do that on the quarterly basis under absolute stringent non-disclosure agreement.
Right.
So we launched this today. It was announced by eScrap News, so it should be in your eScrap newsletter. We are going to, compliance standards are going to do a press release tonight or tomorrow morning, and then we're going to do a direct reach out to our connections in the industry to please take the survey. It will be absolutely confidential. and we want to understand what it's all about. Longer term, I think for us, we have quite a lot to deal with in terms of at least the medium term, between the marketing coalition and the Itad Academy and this ongoing survey and work that we traditionally do with end user companies. I think this is going to keep us busy for quite a while, for sure. Longer term, we are still interested in consumer recycling. It's not something that's in huge demand because we do rely on our customers to help us cover the cost. It's not a huge demand, but we're going to do it ourselves just to assess the kind of questions that you asked about sort of the circular economy.
Right.
If there is a discussion about circular economy and it's successful, it will be reflected in these surveys. And if it's not reflected in the surveys, then guys, we need to go back to the drawing board. So that's what we're going to be doing. And we have right now a vision of 2 to 3 years, really. Longer term, it gets very, very difficult.
Got it. Well, perfect, David. And I'm really excited. I want you to come back on the Impact podcast and give us updates on the Itad Coalition, the Itad Industry Advertising Initiatives, and your partnership with eScrap News and the surveys you're doing. I think it's so important to further rationalize and legitimize the Itad industry. As you said, is massive opportunities to grow, but still more work is needed ahead. David Daoud, I thank you for making tremendous impacts and making the world a better place. To find David and his colleagues and all the important work they're doing at Compliance Standards, please go to www.compliancestandards.com. David, continued success. I can't wait to have you back on the Impact Podcast, and we look forward to hearing all the updates that you have on the Itad industry soon.
John, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much, sir. I'm looking forward to grabbing coffee with you at some point. Thank you.
This edition of the Impact Podcast is brought to you by Trajectory Energy Partners. Trajectory Energy Partners brings together landowners, electricity users, and communities to develop solar energy projects with strong local support. For more information on how Trajectory is leading the solar revolution, please visit trajectoryenergy.com. This edition of the Impact Podcast is brought to you by ERI. ERI has a mission to protect people, the planet, and your privacy, and is the largest fully integrated IT and electronics asset disposition provider and cybersecurity-focused hardware destruction company in the United States, and maybe even the world. For more information on how ERI can help your business properly dispose of outdated electronic hardware devices, please visit eridirect.com.